You've been listening to people your entire life, but you've never truly understood them. You heard their words. You believed their explanations. You trusted their tone. And yet, something didn't add up. Because people don't lie only with words. They lie with timing, with silence, with energy, with inconsistency. And the painful truth? You don't get hurt because people are complicated. You get hurt because you were never taught how to read them. In this audiobook, Read People Instantly, The Psychology of Human Behavior, you are going to step into a different level of awareness, a level where confusion fades, where overthinking slows down, where you stop asking, what did they mean, and start seeing exactly what they revealed. Because here's the truth most people avoid. Words are performance. Behavior is evidence. And once you learn to read behavior, everything changes. This audiobook will take you through a journey. You will learn how to decode body language without guessing, how to recognize emotional patterns before they become problems, how to understand silence, pressure, reactions, and contradictions, how to see through masks without becoming cold, how to build awareness without losing empathy. This is not manipulation. This is clarity. And one line I want you to remember before we go any further: the person who sees clearly moves differently. This is not about controlling others. It's about no longer being controlled by confusion. And before we begin, understand this clearly. This audiobook is for educational and self-awareness purposes. It is not about labeling people or making instant judgments. It is about observation, understanding, and growth. Because the goal is not to become suspicious of everyone. The goal is to become aware of everything. Now ask yourself, how many times have you replayed conversations in your head, trying to understand what really happened? How many times have you trusted someone's words, only to be confused by their actions later? How many times did you feel something was off, but ignored it? That feeling wasn't weakness. It was untrained awareness. Because, as you may have already sensed from the insights in, and human behavior rarely reveals itself directly. It reveals itself through patterns, through reactions, through what people do, not what they say. And once you understand that, you stop chasing explanations. You start observing truth. This is where everything begins. Chapter 1. The hidden language you've been missing your entire life. Before someone speaks, they've already told you who they are, not through words, through presence, through posture, through eye movement, through the way they enter a room or hesitate at the door. Every human being is constantly communicating, even in silence, especially in silence. The problem is not that people hide things. The problem is that most people are not trained to see what is being shown. Think about this. Two people walk into a room. One stands straight, scans the environment calmly, moves with measured steps. The other avoids eye contact, shifts weight from foot to foot, checks their phone repeatedly. Neither has spoken, but both have already said something. Confidence, uncertainty, comfort, tension. The signals are there, always. But here's where most people go wrong. They look for single signs, a crossed arm, a broken gaze, a nervous smile, and they assume meaning instantly, but real understanding doesn't come from isolated moments. It comes from patterns. Because behavior is not random. Behavior is consistent under comfort and revealing under pressure. So the first principle you must understand is this. Do not read moments. Read changes. Every person has a baseline, a natural way they speak, move, react, and exist when they feel safe. And when that baseline shifts, that's where the truth begins. Maybe their voice tightens, maybe their breathing changes, maybe their energy drops or spikes. Not because they are bad, but because something inside them has changed. And your job is not to judge that change. Your job is to notice it. Because awareness is not about accusation. It's about recognition. Now imagine this. You're having a conversation with someone. Everything feels normal. Then suddenly, there's a pause, a slight hesitation before they answer a simple question. Their tone changes just a little. Their eyes break contact for a fraction of a second longer than usual. Most people ignore this. They continue the conversation as if nothing happened, but a trained observer pauses internally, not reacting, just noting, because small shifts lead to big understanding. And this is where your power begins to grow, not in reacting faster, but in observing deeper. Because when you stop rushing to conclusions, you start seeing connections. You start recognizing patterns. You start understanding people in a way that feels almost effortless. And here's something even deeper. The more emotional the situation, the more honest the behavior becomes. People can control their words, but under pressure, their reactions leak truth. Think about arguments, think about stress, think about unexpected questions. That's when the mask slips, even if just for a second. And if you are present in that second, you see everything. Not because you're smarter, but because you're paying attention. And this changes the way you move through life. You stop being surprised by people. You stop being confused by contradictions. You stop asking, why did they do that? And instead, you start saying, that makes sense. Not with judgment, with clarity. Because once you understand behavior, you understand motive. Once you understand motive, you understand direction. And once you understand direction, you protect your energy without needing to fight. Now let me ask you something. What would change in your life if you could instantly sense when someone is not aligned with their words? What decisions would you make differently? What conversations would you handle with more control? What situations would you avoid entirely? This is not just about reading others. It's about protecting yourself. It's about moving through the world with calm awareness instead of emotional reaction. Because most people don't lose because they lack intelligence. They lose because they misread people. And misreading people leads to wrong trust, wrong timing, wrong expectations. But that ends here, because in the next chapter, you're going to discover something even more powerful than body language. Something most people completely overlook. Something that reveals more truth than words, tone, or posture combined. The patterns behind behavior. And once you see patterns, you don't just read moments, you predict outcomes. Dear friend, we are just starting to work on this channel, so your likes and subscriptions will greatly help us grow. Don't be indifferent. Thank you. Chapter 2. The Patterns That Never Lie. Most people look at life like it's a series of isolated moments, a conversation here, a reaction there, a decision that seems random, disconnected. But human behavior doesn't work like that. Behavior is not a collection of moments. It is a pattern. And once you understand this, you stop being confused by people because you stop looking at what they did once and start noticing what they do repeatedly, because repetition is the loudest form of truth. think about someone you know, maybe a friend, a colleague, a partner. Now ask yourself honestly, do they act differently every time? Or do they follow a familiar rhythm? Maybe they apologize often, but repeat the same behavior. Maybe they show enthusiasm, but disappear when it matters. Maybe they promise, but delay action. At first glance, these seem like separate situations, but they're not. They're patterns, and patterns don't lie even when people do. This is something deeply rooted in human psychology and hinted at throughout the ideas explored in People Don't Reveal Themselves Directly. They reveal themselves through consistency, not perfect consistency, but emotional consistency, behavioral tendencies, default reactions. Because no matter how someone tries to present themselves, their patterns always leak through. And once you train yourself to see patterns, something inside you becomes calm. You stop chasing clarity. You stop needing constant explanations. You stop asking, quote 6, because meaning becomes obvious over time. Now here's where it gets powerful. Patterns show up strongest in 3 places: comfort, conflict, and commitment. Let's break that down. In comfort, people show their natural baseline, how they act when nothing is at stake, how they joke, speak, relax, respond. This is where you learn who they are, without pressure. But in conflict, that's where the real signals begin, because conflict introduces emotion, and emotion removes filters. Someone who shuts down under pressure shows avoidance. Someone who becomes aggressive shows controlled tendencies. Someone who deflects responsibility shows insecurity, not because they're bad, but because that's their pattern under stress. And then there's commitment. This is where most people get misled, because commitment is not what someone says they'll do. It's what they repeatedly follow through on. Consistency over time, effort when it's inconvenient, presence when it's not easy. That's commitment. Everything else is intention, and intention feels good. But behavior tells the truth. Now imagine this scenario. Someone tells you they care about you. They say the right words. They express concern. They reassure you. But when you look at their pattern, they cancel often. They don't show up when needed. They prioritize other things consistently. Now here's the question. Which one is real? The words or the pattern? And this is where most people struggle, because emotionally, they want to believe the words, but logically, the pattern is undeniable. And when you ignore patterns, you create confusion. When you follow patterns, you create clarity. This is one of the most important shifts you will ever make, because once you start trusting patterns, you stop being surprised. You stop being disappointed by the same behaviors. You stop giving chances based on hope and start making decisions based on evidence. And here's the deeper truth. Patterns don't just reveal others. They reveal you, because the reason you tolerate certain behaviors is also a pattern. The reason you overlook red flags is also a pattern. The reason you explain away inconsistency is also a pattern. So, as you learn to read people, you also begin to read yourself. And that's where real power begins. Because awareness without self-awareness becomes judgment. But awareness with self-awareness becomes wisdom. Now let's go even deeper. There's something most people miss when observing patterns. They only look at what people do. But real observers look at when people do it. Timing, because timing is a signal. If someone only reaches out when they need something, that's a pattern. If someone only shows effort when they feel they might lose you, that's a pattern. If someone avoids conversations until pressure builds, that's a pattern. And timing reveals intention more clearly than words ever could, because behavior under convenience is easy. Behavior under inconvenience is truth. And once you understand this, you stop being impressed by temporary effort. You start respecting consistent presence. You stop reacting to emotional moments. You start observing long-term behavior, and everything becomes clearer. Now let me pause here for a moment, because this is where your awareness is either going to grow or resist. Because once you see patterns, you can't unsee them, and that can be uncomfortable, because it forces you to face reality without the filter of hope. But it also frees you, because clarity removes anxiety. Clarity removes overthinking. Clarity gives you control, not over others, but over your decisions. And that's the real goal here, not to analyze people endlessly, but to understand them just enough to move wisely. Now imagine walking into a room, and instead of trying to figure people out instantly, you simply observe. You notice how people interact. You notice who leads, who follows, who withdraws. You notice energy shifts. You notice consistency. And over time, you don't need to guess anymore. You just know, quietly, calmly, clearly. That's what this audiobook is building inside you. A different way of seeing, a calmer way of understanding, a sharper way of moving through people without losing yourself. And if this is already starting to shift something in you, take a moment, pause, and make a small agreement with yourself that from today forward, you will stop ignoring patterns, because that one decision will change the quality of your relationships, your decisions, and your peace. And if this moment resonates with you, you already know what to do. Leave a like as a commitment to your own awareness. And in the comments, write one pattern you've noticed in someone recently, not to judge them, but to train your observation. Because awareness grows when you use it. Now, we're about to move into something even more precise, something subtle, but incredibly powerful. Something that happens in less than a second, but reveals more truth than long conversations ever could. In the next chapter, you'll learn how to read micro-expressions, the emotions people try to hide but can't fully control. And once you see them, you won't just hear what people say. You'll see what they feel. Chapter 3. The truth in a fraction of a second. There is a moment so fast, most people never notice it. A flicker across the face, a tightening around the eyes, a brief curl of the lip, gone before the mind can process it. And yet, in that fraction of a second, the truth is revealed. Not the polished truth, not the rehearsed truth, but the raw, emotional truth. These are called micro-expressions. And once you learn to see them, conversations change forever, because people can control what they say. They can manage their tone. They can adjust their posture. They can even fake a smile. But they cannot fully control emotion at the exact moment it appears. Emotion always arrives first. Control comes after. And that tiny gap is where truth lives. Now imagine this. You ask someone a simple question, quote 7. They respond quickly, quote 8. But just before they speak, there's a flash, a tightening of the jaw, a flicker of sadness in the eyes, a brief tension that disappears almost instantly. Most people miss it. They hear the words and move on. but you don't, because now you're trained to notice. And in that moment, you understand something deeper. Not necessarily that they're lying, but that their emotional state doesn't match their words. And that is where awareness begins. Micro-expressions are not about catching people. They're about understanding them, because emotions are honest, even when people are not ready to express them. And when you learn to recognize these signals, you become more empathetic, not more suspicious. You start seeing pain where others see indifference. You notice discomfort where others hear confidence. You recognize hesitation even when words sound certain. This is a different level of listening, listening with your eyes. Now, let's go deeper. There are a few core emotional flashes that show up across all people. And once you understand them, you start seeing them everywhere. Happiness, real happiness, not the polite smile. It reaches the eyes. The corners lift naturally. The face softens. There's ease, not tension. Fake happiness, it stays in the mouth. The eyes don't follow. There's effort, not flow. And once you see that difference, you can't unsee it. Then there's anger. Not always loud. Sometimes it's subtle. A slight tightening of the lips, a narrowing of the eyes, a microsecond of tension, quickly hidden, but it's there. Because anger doesn't need volume to exist. It only needs a trigger. And when you notice it early, you understand the emotional direction of the conversation before it escalates. Then there's fear. And fear is one of the fastest emotions to flash. Widened eyes, raised brows, a quick intake of breath. Even if it disappears instantly, it leaves a trace. And that trace tells you something important. That something, in that moment, created discomfort. Not necessarily danger, but uncertainty. And uncertainty is powerful, because people act differently when they feel it. Then there's something even more subtle. Contempt. The quietest, and often the most dangerous. A slight smirk on one side of the mouth. A brief expression of superiority, disrespect, hidden in a fraction of a second. And here's why this matters. Because contempt rarely shows up alone. It builds over time. And when it starts appearing in micro-expressions, it reveals deeper emotional patterns. Now, pause for a moment. Because this is not about memorizing faces. It's about becoming present enough to notice changes. Because the real skill is not seeing everything. It's seeing what shifts. Because just like behavior has a baseline, so does expression. Some people naturally smile more. Some people have more serious faces. Some people show emotion easily. So again, you don't read isolated moments. You read deviations. If someone usually maintains steady eye contact and suddenly starts breaking it during a specific topic, that matters. If someone is usually relaxed and suddenly shows tension in their face when answering a question, that matters. Not because it confirms anything instantly, but because it points your awareness in a direction. And awareness is your greatest advantage. Now here's something most people misunderstand. Micro-expressions don't give you absolute truth. They give you clues. And your job is not to jump to conclusions. Your job is to collect signals, to observe patterns, to connect behaviors, because real understanding comes from accumulation, not assumption. And this is where emotional intelligence begins to sharpen. Because instead of reacting, you start processing. Instead of confronting, you start observing. Instead of guessing, you start understanding. And this changes your energy completely. You become calmer in conversations, more patient, less reactive, because you're no longer relying on words alone. You're reading the full picture. Now imagine how this affects your life. Conversations feel clearer, decisions feel easier. You stop over-investing in uncertainty. You stop ignoring subtle discomfort. You trust your observation, not just your interpretations. And here's the most powerful part. People feel it. They may not know what you're doing, but they feel your awareness. They feel your presence. They feel that you're not just hearing them, you're seeing them. And that creates a different kind of respect. Because in a world where most people are distracted, attention becomes rare. And rare things hold power. Now let me ask you something. How many times have you felt something was off, but ignored it because you couldn't explain it? That feeling was your mind catching micro signals without training to understand them. But now, you're building that training. Now, you're sharpening that awareness. And over time, what once felt like intuition becomes clarity. And clarity becomes confidence. Not loud confidence, not aggressive confidence, calm confidence, the kind that doesn't need validation, the kind that doesn't need to prove anything, the kind that simply knows. Now, as we move forward, we're going to step into something even deeper, because reading people is not just about seeing them. It's about understanding what drives them, why they react, why they hide, why they reveal. In the next chapter, you're going to discover the invisible forces behind behavior, the emotional triggers, the subconscious patterns, the hidden motivations that shape everything people do. Because once you understand what drives behavior, you don't just observe people, you understand them. And that is where true mastery begins. Chapter 4. The invisible forces that drive behavior. What you see is never the full story. A reaction, a tone shift, a sudden withdrawal, an unexpected burst of emotion. On the surface, it looks like a choice, but underneath, it's a reaction to something deeper. Because human behavior is not random. It is driven by emotion, driven by fear, driven by desire, driven by memory, and most of the time, people themselves don't fully understand why they act the way they do. That's what makes this powerful. Because when you learn to see beyond the action, you begin to understand the cause. And once you understand the cause, you stop taking things personally. You start seeing patterns of human nature instead of isolated moments. Now let's begin with something simple but life-changing. Every behavior is either moving toward something or away from something. Toward pleasure, toward approval, toward safety, or away from pain, away from rejection, away from discomfort. That's it. Everything people do can be traced back to one of these directions. Now imagine this. Someone avoids answering a question directly. You might think they're being difficult. But what if they're avoiding discomfort? What if they're protecting themselves from judgment? What if their silence is not resistance, but fear? Suddenly, the meaning changes. Not because the behavior is justified, but because it is understood. And understanding gives you control over your response. Because instead of reacting emotionally, you respond with awareness. Now here's where it gets deeper. There are 3 core internal forces that shape most human behavior: fear, desire, identity. Let's break them down. Fear is the strongest driver. Not always obvious, not always loud, but always present. Fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of not being enough, fear of losing control. These fears don't just sit quietly. They influence decisions. They shape reactions. They create patterns. Someone who constantly seeks approval. Fear of rejection. Someone who avoids responsibility. Fear of failure. Someone who dominates conversations. Fear of losing control. And once you see the fear behind the behavior, you stop labeling people too quickly. You start understanding what they're protecting. Because behavior is often protection in disguise. Now let's talk about desire. Desire is what people move toward. Recognition, connection, success, validation, freedom. And here's the key. People don't always express their desires clearly, but they reveal them through actions. What they prioritize, what they invest time in, what they talk about repeatedly. That's where desire lives. If someone constantly seeks attention, it's not just behavior. It's a desire to be seen. If someone works relentlessly, it's not just discipline. It's a desire for achievement, or security, or meaning. And when you understand what someone desires, you understand what motivates them. Now the third force, identity. This is the deepest one. Because people don't just act based on fear or desire. They act based on who they believe they are, or who they need to be. Identity shapes everything. Quote 9, quote 10, quote 11, quote 12. These internal narratives, they guide behavior silently, even when they're not true, even when they're limiting, because people protect their identity even at the cost of growth. Now, imagine someone who never asks for help, not because they don't need it, but because their identity says underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 1, 3, underscore, underscore. That's not logic. That's identity. And until that identity shifts, the behavior won't change. This is why some patterns repeat, even when people know better. Because awareness alone doesn't override identity. Now here's where your understanding becomes powerful. When you observe someone, don't just ask. Quote 14 ask, quote 15, quote 16, quote 17. Because those answers explain behavior more clearly than the behavior itself. And this changes everything. Because instead of reacting to surface-level actions, you begin to understand deeper motivations. And when you understand motivations, you don't get pulled into emotional chaos. You stay grounded. You stay aware. You stay in control of your energy. Now let's take this one step further. Pressure. Pressure reveals truth faster than comfort ever will, because under pressure, fear intensifies. Desire sharpens. Identity becomes rigid or cracks. Think about it. When everything is easy, people can maintain an image. They can stay composed. They can present themselves in a certain way. But when pressure hits, time pressure, emotional pressure, unexpected situations, that's when the real patterns emerge. That's when behavior becomes honest. And this aligns with something subtle you may have already sensed from that pressure. Exposes character faster than comfort ever could. So if you want to understand someone, don't just observe them when everything is smooth. Watch how they react when things shift. Do they stay calm or panic? Do they communicate or withdraw? Do they take responsibility or deflect? That's where clarity lives. Now pause for a moment, because this is where your perspective begins to evolve. You stop seeing behavior as random. You stop labeling people too quickly. You start seeing layers, emotion, motivation, identity, and suddenly people make more sense. Not perfect sense, but enough to move wisely. Now let me ask you something. What would happen if you stopped reacting to what people do and started understanding why they do it? How would that change your conversations, your relationships, your decisions? Because the moment you understand the quote 18, you stop being controlled by the quote 19, and that is power, calm power, the kind that doesn't need to prove anything, the kind that simply sees and responds. Now, as we move forward, we're going to uncover something even more subtle, something that most people completely ignore. But once you notice it, it becomes impossible to miss. Energy, the invisible atmosphere people carry, the feeling you get before words are even spoken. Because in the next chapter, you're going to learn how to read emotional energy and understand people before they even say a single word. We're so glad you decided to watch our video. We're also really curious to know which cities around the world are watching our videos. Could you let us know which city, or at least which country, you're from? We always read every comment under our videos carefully. Thank you. Chapter 5. The energy you feel before words exist. Have you ever walked into a room and instantly felt something was off? No one said anything yet, no clear signal, no obvious reason, and still you felt it. Tension, warmth, distance, curiosity, discomfort. That feeling is not random. That is energy. And whether people realize it or not, they carry it everywhere they go. Before words are spoken, before expressions are analyzed, before behavior is processed, energy is already communicating, and most people ignore it because it's not logical, it's not measurable, it's not easy to explain. But it is real, and once you learn to trust it, it becomes one of your most powerful tools. Now let's be clear about something. Energy is not mystical, it's psychological. It's the result of emotional state, body language, tone, presence, and subconscious signals, all combined into one experience. It's what your brain processes instantly before your conscious mind catches up. That's why sometimes you just know something feels right or wrong, even if you can't explain why. Because your mind has already read the signals, you just haven't translated them yet. Now imagine this. You meet two people. The first one speaks confidently. They say the right things, they smile, they maintain eye contact, but something feels forced. There's tension behind the words, a subtle inconsistency. You can't point to it directly, but you feel it. The second person says less. They're calm, their tone is steady, their presence is grounded, and even without trying, they feel authentic. That difference is energy, and once you start paying attention to it, you begin to understand people faster than words ever could. Because words can be controlled energy, leaks. Now here's where it gets deeper. Energy is not just what people show, it's what they carry. Someone who is anxious will carry that anxiety into conversations, even if they try to hide it. Someone who is confident will carry that calm presence, even in silence. Someone who is frustrated will leak tension through tone, posture, pacing, and here's the key. You don't need to analyze every detail. You just need to notice how you feel around them, because your emotional response is data, not judgment, not assumption, data. Now, most people ignore this data. They override it with logic. He said the right thing. She seems nice. It's probably nothing. And they dismiss the feeling, but that feeling is your awareness trying to communicate with you, And the more you ignore it, the weaker it becomes. The more you trust it, the sharper it gets. Now let's go even deeper. There are 3 types of energy you'll begin to recognize. Congruent energy. This is when someone's words, behavior, and emotional state all align. What they say matches how they feel. What they express matches how they act. There's no friction, no confusion, just clarity. These people feel easy to understand because there's nothing hidden. Then there's incongruent energy. This is where things feel off. Words say one thing, energy says another. Someone says they're excited, but their tone is flat. Someone says they're okay, but their presence feels heavy. Someone says they're confident, but their body shows tension. This mismatch is one of the strongest signals you can notice because it tells you something is not aligned, not necessarily a lie, but a disconnect. And finally, neutral energy. This is when someone is emotionally closed, not expressive, not reactive, not revealing. And this can be tricky because silence can mean many things. Comfort, discomfort, disinterest, processing. So here, context matters more than ever. Now pause for a moment, because this is where your awareness becomes refined. You stop focusing only on what people say. You start noticing how they feel. You start observing presence, not just performance. And that changes everything, because when you understand energy, you don't get pulled into emotional confusion. You don't chase explanations. You don't overanalyze words. You simply observe and adjust. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever ignored your gut feeling and later realized it was right? That moment, was your awareness detecting energy before your mind caught up? And this connects deeply with something subtle reflected in that people reveal themselves indirectly through signals, reactions, and patterns, not just direct communication. Energy is one of those signals. Now here's the most important shift. Do not react to energy immediately. Observe it, because awareness without control leads to misinterpretation. But awareness with patience leads to clarity. Notice patterns. Notice consistency. Notice how someone's energy changes in different situations. Because energy is not static. It shifts with emotion. And those shifts tell a story. Now imagine this. You're in a conversation. Everything seems normal. But suddenly, the energy changes. It becomes tense, slightly uncomfortable, something subtle, but noticeable. That's your moment, not to react, but to observe. Because something just shifted internally for the other person. And if you stay calm, you'll see what comes next. And what comes next reveals everything. Now this is where your presence becomes powerful, because most people react to energy unconsciously. They match it. Tension creates tension. Frustration creates frustration. Anxiety spreads. But when you are aware, you don't mirror automatically. You choose. You can stay calm when others become reactive. You can stay grounded when others become emotional. You can control your energy instead of being controlled by theirs. And that changes your position in every interaction. Because the calm observer always sees more than the reactive participant. Now let that sink in, because this is not just about reading people. It's about mastering your own state. Because if your emotions control you, you won't see clearly. But if you stay grounded, your awareness becomes sharp. And sharp awareness sees everything. Now, as we move forward, we're going to unlock something even more practical, something you use every single day. without realizing its full power. Speech, not just what people say, but how they say it. Tone, pacing, hesitation, word choice. Because in the next chapter, you'll learn how to listen beyond words and hear what people are really communicating even when they think they're hiding it. Chapter 6. Listening to what is never said. Most people believe they are good listeners. They nod, they respond, they remember parts of the conversation. But listening is not hearing words. Listening is decoding meaning, because words are only the surface, and underneath that surface there's tone, pacing, hesitation, emphasis, and silence. That's where the truth hides. Now think about this for a moment. Two people say the exact same sentence. I'm fine. Same words, same structure, but completely different meanings. One says it lightly, relaxed, open, steady. The other says it quickly, clipped, tight, slightly forced, and without realizing it, you feel the difference. Because you're not just hearing words, you're hearing signals. And once you train yourself to listen at that level, you begin to understand people far beyond what they say. Now let's break this down. There are 4 layers to how people communicate when they speak: words, tone, pacing, silence. Most people focus only on the first, but real observers pay attention to all 4. Let's start with tone. Tone is emotional direction. It tells you how someone feels about what they're saying. A calm tone signals ease. A sharp tone signals tension. A flat tone signals disengagement. A fluctuating tone signals uncertainty. Now here's the key. Tone is very hard to fake consistently. Someone might control their words, but their tone will shift under pressure. It will leak emotion, and that's where your awareness comes in. Because when words and tone don't match, you pay attention to tone, always. Because tone is closer to truth than words. Now let's talk about pacing. How fast or slow someone speaks. Because speed reveals internal state. Fast speech can indicate anxiety, excitement, or pressure. Slow speech can indicate control, confident, or careful thinking. But here's where it gets powerful. Changes in pacing reveal shifts in emotion. If someone suddenly speeds up, something changed. If someone pauses longer than usual, something changed. And those changes are your signals. Now let's go deeper. Hesitation. This is one of the most overlooked indicators. That small pause before answering, that slight delay before responding, that moment where words don't come instantly. Most people ignore it, but hesitation is not random. It often means one of 3 things. They're thinking carefully, they're unsure, or they're filtering what to say. Now here's where context matters. If someone is usually quick to respond and suddenly hesitates on a specific topic, that's not accidental. That's a shift, and shifts reveal information. Now let's talk about something even more powerful: silence. Because silence communicates more than words ever could. Silence after a question. Silence during tension. Silence when something important is said. Each type of silence carries meaning. Comfortable silence feels calm. Uncomfortable silence feels heavy. Avoidant silence feels evasive. Reflective silence feels thoughtful. And once you start recognizing the difference, you stop trying to fill every gap with words. You start observing, because silence often invites truth. Now imagine this. You ask someone a direct question. Instead of answering immediately, they pause. They shift slightly. They respond, but not directly. Most people move on, but not you. because you understand something now. That hesitation was not empty. It was processing, filtering, deciding, and that tells you something important. Now, here's the deeper layer, word choice, because the words people choose reveal how they think. Someone who says, "I'll try," is not the same as someone who says, "I will." Someone who says, "maybe later," is not the same as someone who says, "not now." Subtle differences, but powerful signals, because language reflects internal certainty, or lack of it, and once you start paying attention, you begin to hear intention, not just sentences. Now pause for a moment, because this is where your listening transforms. You stop taking words at face value. You start analyzing structure, tone, and delivery. You begin to hear the layers behind communication, and this aligns deeply with something hinted in that how people speak often reveals more than what they say, because tone, rhythm, and pauses carry meaning beyond language. Now let's take this even further. There's something called emotional leakage. This is when someone's internal state spills into their communication without them realizing it. A forced laugh, a sharp reply, a defensive tone, an unexpected reaction. These are not accidents. They are leaks. And when you notice them, you gain insight into what's happening beneath the surface. Now, here's the most important rule. Do not interrupt the pattern. Let people speak. Let them finish. Let them reveal themselves. Because the more someone talks, the more signals they give, and your job is not to control the conversation. It's to understand it. Now imagine how this changes your interactions. You become more patient, more observant, less reactive. You don't rush to respond. You listen to understand, not to reply. And that alone puts you in a different position. Because in a world where most people are waiting to speak, the one who truly listens sees everything. Now let me ask you something. How many times have you missed something important because you were focused on what to say next? That changes now, because from this point forward, you're not just hearing words, you're decoding behavior, you're reading tone, you're observing silence, you're understanding people in real time. And that is a rare skill. Now, as we move forward, we're going to explore something even more revealing, because there's a moment where people show their true nature faster than anywhere else, not in comfort, not in routine, but under pressure. In the next chapter, you'll learn how to read people in high-stress situations, and why pressure reveals more truth in seconds than hours of normal conversation ever could. Chapter 7. Pressure reveals what comfort hides. There is a version of every person that only shows up when things get difficult, not when everything is easy, not when the environment is calm, not when they have time to think, filter, and present themselves, but when something shifts, when pressure enters the moment. That's when behavior becomes honest, because pressure removes the mask faster than time ever could. Now think about this. In normal situations, people manage their image. They choose their words carefully. They control their tone. They present themselves in a way that feels acceptable. But under pressure, that control weakens, not completely, but enough for truth to leak through. And if you're paying attention, you'll see it. Now let's define what pressure actually means. Pressure is anything that disrupts comfort, an unexpected question, a time constraint, an emotional trigger, a challenging situation, anything that forces someone out of their usual state. And in that moment, Their real patterns begin to show. Now imagine this. You're talking to someone casually. They seem calm, confident, in control. But then you ask a question they didn't expect. Suddenly, there's a pause. Their tone changes. Their posture shifts. Their response becomes less smooth. That's pressure. And that reaction? That's information. Because pressure doesn't create new behavior. It reveals existing behavior. It exposes what was already there, beneath the surface. Now here's where it becomes powerful. There are 3 common reactions people have under pressure: fight, flight, freeze. And once you recognize these patterns, you begin to understand people at a deeper level. Let's start with fight. This is when someone becomes confrontational. They raise their voice. They interrupt. They become defensive. Not always aggressively, sometimes subtly, but the energy shifts toward control because internally they feel threatened, and their response is to push back. Now, here's the key. This doesn't mean they are bad. It means their default reaction to pressure is confrontation. Now let's look at flight. This is avoidance, changing the subject, deflecting the question, withdrawing from the conversation, not engaging fully because internally they feel overwhelmed and their response is to escape the discomfort. Then there's freeze. This is hesitation, silence, delayed responses, visible uncertainty, because internally they're processing, but struggling to respond. Now, here's where most people make a mistake. They judge these reactions instantly. He's aggressive. She's avoiding. They're weak. But real observers don't jump to labels. They ask, what is this reaction telling me? Because every reaction under pressure is a pattern. And patterns reveal how someone handles stress, conflict, and uncertainty. Now think about how valuable that is, because life is full of pressure, relationships, work, decisions. So if you understand how someone reacts under pressure, you understand how they will behave when it matters most. Not when things are easy, but when things are real. And that's where clarity lives. Now let's take this deeper. Pressure also reveals emotional priorities. What matters most to someone shows up when they feel challenged. If someone becomes defensive quickly, it often means they're protecting something. Their image, their identity, their sense of control. If someone avoids certain topics, it often means those areas carry emotional weight, fear, insecurity, uncertainty. And once you recognize these signals, you don't push blindly, you observe carefully. Because pressure is not just a tool for reading others, it's a moment of truth. And truth should be handled with awareness. Now here's something subtle, but critical. The way someone handles small pressure predicts how they handle big pressure. If someone becomes reactive over minor challenges, what happens when the stakes are higher? If someone avoids simple discomfort, what happens when real decisions need to be made? Patterns scale. And once you see the small ones, you understand the big ones. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever seen someone completely change when things got difficult? Calm becomes reactive. Confident becomes uncertain. Kind becomes distant. That wasn't a new person. That was the real pattern revealed. And this connects deeply with something reflected in that pressure exposes character faster than comfort ever could. Because comfort allows performance. Pressure demands authenticity. Now, here's where your awareness becomes powerful. You don't need to create pressure. Life does that naturally. Your job is to observe when it happens, to stay present, to notice reactions, without immediately reacting yourself. Because most people get pulled into the moment. They match the emotion. They respond impulsively. But you stay grounded. You watch. You understand. And that gives you an advantage, not over people, but over situations. Now imagine this. You're in a tense conversation. The other person becomes defensive. Their tone sharpens. Their words become more aggressive. Most people would react, push back, defend themselves, escalate. But you don't. You notice. You recognize the pattern. You understand that the reaction is not just about you. It's about what they're experiencing internally. And instead of escalating, you stay calm. And that changes everything. Because when one person stays grounded, the entire dynamic shifts. Now, this doesn't mean you tolerate everything. It means you respond with awareness, not impulse. And that is control. Real control. Now pause for a moment, because this is where your growth deepens. You're no longer just reading people in calm situations. You're understanding them in real moments. And real moments are where truth lives. Now, as we move forward, we're going to explore something even more personal, because reading others is only half the equation. The other half is understanding how your own mind interferes with what you see, your biases, your assumptions, your projections. Because in the next chapter, you'll discover why we misread people and how your own thinking can distort reality without you even realizing it. Chapter 8, The Illusion Inside Your Own Mind. Before you master reading people, you must confront something uncomfortable. The biggest reason you misread others is not because of them. It's because of you. Your mind is not a neutral observer. It is a filter. And that filter is shaped by your past experiences, your beliefs, your fears, and your expectations. So when you look at someone, you're not just seeing them. You're seeing your interpretation of them. And that distinction changes everything. Now think about this. Two people witness the exact same behavior. One sees confidence, the other sees arrogance. One sees independence, the other sees distance. One sees honesty, the other sees harshness. Same behavior, different interpretations. Why? Because perception is personal. And if you don't understand your own biases, you will misread people again and again. Now let's break this down. There are 3 major ways your mind distorts what you see: projection, assumption, emotional bias. Let's start with projection. Projection is when you assign your own thoughts, values, or emotions to someone else. You assume they think like you. You assume they feel like you. You assume they would act the way you would. But they don't, because they are not you. And this is where misunderstanding begins. For example, if you are honest, you expect honesty. If you are loyal, you expect loyalty. If you communicate clearly, you expect others to do the same. And when they don't, you feel confused. But the confusion doesn't come from their behavior. It comes from your expectation, because you projected your standard onto them, and reality didn't match. Now here's the truth. People don't operate based on your values. They operate based on theirs. And once you accept that, you stop being surprised. You start observing. Now let's talk about assumption. This is when you fill in gaps without enough information. Someone doesn't reply quickly. You assume they don't care. Someone seems distant. You assume they're upset. Someone acts differently. You assume something is wrong. But here's the problem. Assumptions feel like facts, even when they're not. Because Your mind wants closure. It wants to make sense of incomplete information, so it creates a story, and that story feels real. But often, it's not accurate, and when you act on assumptions, you create reactions based on incomplete truth. Now, let's go deeper. Emotional bias. This is when your current emotional state distorts how you interpret behavior. If you feel insecure, you might see rejection where none exists. If you feel anxious, you might see problems where there are none. If you feel frustrated, you might interpret neutral behavior as negative because emotion influences perception, and perception influences reaction. Now pause for a moment, because this is where awareness becomes internal. You're no longer just analyzing others, you're observing yourself. And this is critical, because without self-awareness, reading people becomes dangerous. You start seeing what you expect instead of what is real. You start confirming your own beliefs instead of observing objectively. And that leads to misunderstanding, not clarity. Now here's the shift. Instead of asking, "What does this mean?" start asking, "What else could this mean?" Because that question creates space. It slows down your reaction, it opens your awareness, and it protects you from jumping to conclusions. Now imagine this. Someone responds to you in a short, distant way. Your first thought might be, "They're upset with me." But instead of reacting, you pause. You ask, "What else could this mean?" Maybe they're busy. Maybe they're stressed. Maybe they're distracted. Now, instead of reacting emotionally, you stay neutral. You observe. And over time, you gather more information. That's how clarity is built, not through instant judgment, but through patient observation. Now, here's something even deeper. Your past experiences shape your present perception. If you've been hurt before, you might look for signs of betrayal. If you've been ignored, you might look for signs of rejection. If you've been lied to, you might look for signs of dishonesty. And without realizing it, you start seeing patterns that may not exist, because your mind is trying to protect you. But protection without awareness becomes distortion, and distortion leads to misreading. Now this aligns deeply with something subtle from that we often misjudge people not just because of them, but because of our own projections and assumptions. And once you see that, you gain something rare, the ability to step back, to observe without immediately interpreting, to see behavior before labeling it. Now let me ask you something. How many times have you reacted to something only to realize later you misunderstood it? That moment. Was your mind filling in gaps too quickly? But now, you're slowing that process down. Now, you're becoming aware of your own thinking, and that changes everything. Because the more aware you are of your own mind, the clearer you see others. Now here's the most powerful shift. You don't aim to eliminate bias completely. That's not realistic. You aim to recognize it, to notice when your emotions are influencing your interpretation, to pause before reacting, to observe before concluding, because awareness is not about perfection. It's about control. Control over your perception, control over your reaction, control over your decisions. And that is where real clarity comes from. Now, as we move forward, we're going to build on this foundation, because once you understand your own mind, you can start influencing interactions more effectively, not through manipulation, but through presence, through subtle alignment, through understanding how connection actually forms. In the next chapter, you'll discover the psychology of rapport, why some people instantly connect, and how you can create that connection naturally and powerfully. Dear viewer, we would really be grateful if you could share your ideas on how we can improve our videos in the comments. Thank you very much. Chapter 9. The Invisible Bridge Between Two Minds. There is a moment in every interaction where connection either forms or quietly disappears. No announcement, no clear signal, just a subtle shift. You feel understood or you don't. You feel aligned or you don't. That moment is called rapport. And most people think rapport is something that just happens. Chemistry, luck, personality. But that's not true. Rapport is built silently, subtly, predictably. And once you understand how it works, you stop hoping for connection and start creating it. Now here's the key idea. People connect with those who feel familiar, not identical, familiar. Because familiarity creates safety, and safety creates openness. So when someone feels like they are being understood, their guard lowers, their communication becomes more natural, their behavior becomes more authentic, and that's where real interaction begins. Now let's break this down. There are 3 core elements that create rapport: mirroring, emotional alignment, attention. Let's start with mirroring. Mirroring is one of the most powerful and most misunderstood tools. It's when you subtly reflect another person's behavior, not copying, not mimicking, obviously, but aligning naturally. If they speak slowly, you slow down. If they use calm energy, you match it. If they lean forward slightly, you become more engaged. Why does this work? Because the human brain is wired to recognize similarity. And similarity creates trust. Not consciously, subconsciously. Now here's the important part. Mirroring must be subtle. If it's forced, it feels unnatural. If it's exaggerated, it breaks connection. But when it's natural, it creates a feeling of ease, a sense of, this person gets me. And most people don't even realize why they feel that way. Now let's move to emotional alignment. This is deeper than behavior. This is about matching emotional state. If someone is excited and you respond with low energy, there's a disconnect. If someone is serious and you respond playfully, there's friction. But when emotional tones align, connection forms faster because people feel understood, not just heard. Now, this doesn't mean you lose yourself. It means you adjust your presence. You meet people where they are before guiding the interaction forward. Now let's talk about attention. Real attention, not passive listening, not waiting to respond, but full presence. Because in today's world, attention is rare. Everyone is distracted, phones, thoughts, internal noise. So when someone feels your full attention, it stands out. And that creates instant value. Now think about this. How often do you talk to someone and feel like they're only half listening? Now imagine the opposite. Someone fully present, listening, observing, engaged. That difference is powerful, and it creates rapport faster than any technique. Now, here's where it gets even deeper. Rapport is not just about making people like you. It's about making people feel safe enough to be real. Because when people feel safe, they stop performing. They stop filtering as much. They become more authentic, and that gives you clearer signals, better understanding, stronger communication. Now here's something important. Rapport can be built and broken quickly. A mismatch in energy, a lack of attention, an inappropriate tone, and suddenly the connection weakens. That's why awareness matters, because when you're aware, you adjust, you notice shifts, you realign. Now this connects deeply with something hinted earlier in that when people feel aligned, they naturally mirror each other and connection forms without effort. That's rapport in action. Now let's take this further. There's a powerful principle. People don't connect with perfection. They connect with authenticity. If you try too hard to impress, it creates distance. If you try to control the interaction, it creates tension. But when you're grounded, when you're present, when you're real, connection happens naturally. Because authenticity is rare, and rare things attract attention. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever met someone and instantly felt comfortable around them? No effort, no overthinking, just ease. That wasn't luck, that was alignment. Now imagine being able to create that feeling intentionally, not by manipulating, but by understanding, by observing, by aligning. That's what you're building here. Now here's the most powerful shift. You stop trying to be liked. You focus on understanding, because when you understand, connection becomes a byproduct, not a goal. And that changes your energy completely. You become calmer, more confident, more present, because you're not chasing approval, you're creating clarity. Now imagine walking into a conversation, not wondering how you're perceived, but focusing on what you observe. That alone changes everything, because attention outward reduces anxiety inward, and that's where your power grows. Now, as we move forward, we're going to explore something even more subtle and often misunderstood, because not all signals are obvious. Some of the most important information comes from what people don't do, not what they say, not what they show, but what they avoid. In the next chapter, you'll learn how to read absence, the missing signals, the avoided topics, the silent gaps that reveal more truth than presence ever could. Chapter 10, the power of what's missing. Most people focus on what is present, the words spoken, the actions taken, the expression shown, but some of the most powerful signals in human behavior come from what is absent, what is avoided, what is ignored, what is never said, because absence is not empty. Absence is information. Now think about this. Someone talks freely about many topics, work, friends, daily life, but every time a certain subject comes up, they shift, they change direction, they give short answers, they avoid going deeper. That's not random, that's absence. And that absence tells a story. Now here's the key. People don't avoid things without reason. Avoidance is protection. Protection of emotion. Protection of identity. Protection of something unresolved. So when you notice what someone avoids, you begin to understand what matters to them, not what they say matters, but what actually carries weight. Now let's go deeper. There are 3 types of absence you need to recognize: avoided topics, missing reactions, withheld effort. Let's start with avoided topics. This is when someone consistently redirects away from certain conversations. It could be subtle, a joke to change direction, a vague answer, a quick shift to something else, and most people ignore it. But you don't, because now you understand. Avoidance is not random. It points to something internal. Now this doesn't mean you push. It means you observe, because pushing without understanding creates resistance, but observing creates clarity. Now let's talk about missing reactions. This one is powerful, because sometimes what people don't react to is more revealing than what they do. Imagine sharing something important, something meaningful, and the response is flat. No emotion, no engagement, no curiosity. That absence tells you something. Because when something matters, people respond. They show interest. They engage. They react. So when that reaction is missing, it reveals disconnection, not necessarily rejection, but lack of alignment. Now let's go even deeper. Withheld effort. This is one of the clearest signals, yet often ignored. Someone says they care. They express intention. But their actions lack consistency. They don't follow through. They don't show up fully. They don't invest energy. That gap between words and effort is absence. And absence of effort reveals priorities, because people make time for what matters to them. They show up for what they value. So when effort is inconsistent, that's not confusion. That's information. Now pause for a moment, because this is where clarity becomes uncomfortable. Because once you see absence, you can't ignore it. You can't explain it away easily. Because it's not about what someone says. It's about what they consistently don't do. And this aligns with something deeply rooted in human behavior. That repetition reveals truth. But so does omission. Now think about your own life. Think about situations where something felt unclear, where words sounded right, but something was missing. That missing piece was absence, and now you're learning to see it. Now here's the most important rule. Do not fill in the gaps for people, because most people do. They explain away absence. They're just busy. They didn't mean it. It's probably nothing. And sometimes that's true. But when absence becomes a pattern, it's no longer accidental. It's intentional. Now here's where your awareness becomes powerful. You don't confront immediately. You observe consistently. You watch for repetition. You notice patterns. Because one moment means little, but repeated absence means everything. Now imagine this. Someone consistently avoids difficult conversations. At first, it seems small, but over time, you notice the pattern, and that pattern tells you something important about how they handle discomfort, about how they communicate, about what to expect in the future. And that awareness protects you, not by creating distance immediately, but by creating understanding. Now let me ask you something. How many times have you ignored what was missing because you focused on what was said? That changes now. Because from this point forward, you're not just observing presence. You're observing absence. And that gives you a fuller picture. Now, here's the deeper shift. You stop chasing clarity through conversation alone. You start observing behavior over time, because behavior fills the gaps that words leave open. Now, this doesn't make you cold. It makes you aware. It makes you grounded. It makes you intentional. Because you're no longer reacting to isolated moments. You're understanding patterns. Now imagine how this changes your decisions. You stop investing energy where effort is missing. You stop overanalyzing mixed signals. You stop waiting for clarity that behavior has already given you. And that creates peace. Now take a moment, because this is where your awareness becomes sharp. You're seeing what others miss. You're understanding what others overlook. And that gives you an advantage, not to control people, but to move wisely around them. Now, as we move forward, we're going to explore something even more personal. Because reading people is not just about observation, it's about interaction. And the way you respond shapes what others reveal. In the next chapter, you'll learn how to ask the right questions and why the way you ask them changes the truth you receive. Chapter 11. The questions that reveal everything. Most people ask questions to get answers, but powerful observers ask questions to reveal truth, because there is a difference. A simple question can give you information. The right question reveals behavior. It exposes thinking. It uncovers emotion. It shows patterns in real time. And once you understand how to ask, you don't need to guess nearly as much. Now think about this. You ask someone, "Are you busy?" They say, "Yeah, a little." That tells you almost nothing. But if you ask, "What's been taking most of your energy lately?" Now they have to reveal something real. Priorities, focus, state of mind. And the difference between those two questions is depth. Now here's the key principle. Closed questions limit truth. Open questions expand it. Closed questions can be answered quickly. Yes, no, maybe. But open questions require thought. They invite explanation. They create space for behavior to show up. Now let's go deeper. There are 3 types of questions that reveal the most about a person. Clarifying questions, perspective questions, pressure questions. Let's start with clarifying questions. These are simple but powerful. They dig deeper into what was just said. For example, someone says, "I've just been really busy." Most people move on. But you ask, "What does busy look like for you right now?" Now they have to explain. And in that explanation, you hear priorities. You hear stress levels. You hear what matters to them. Because people reveal themselves when they explain. Now let's talk about perspective questions. These explore how someone thinks, not just what they do. For example, what do you think matters most in a strong relationship? Now you're not getting surface-level answers. You're getting values, beliefs, internal standards, and those things shape behavior. Now here's where it gets even more powerful. You listen not just to the answer, but how they answer. Do they respond clearly or vaguely? Do they speak with certainty or hesitation? Do they align with their own behavior or contradict it? Because sometimes the way someone answers a question reveals more than the answer itself. Now let's move to pressure questions. These are subtle. They introduce slight discomfort, not aggressively, but enough to observe reaction. For example, how do you usually handle situations when things don't go your way? Now this question touches on control, on emotion, on resilience, and depending on how they respond. You see patterns. Do they take responsibility? Do they blame others? Do they avoid answering directly? That's information. Now here's something important. The goal is not to interrogate. The goal is to observe. Because if your energy feels aggressive, people will close off. But if your energy is calm, curious, neutral, people open up naturally. And that's where truth flows. Now let's take this deeper. There's a powerful technique most people never use. Let silence do the work. After you ask a question, pause. Don't rush to fill the gap. Because silence creates pressure, and pressure invites more truth. Sometimes people will answer, then add more, because they feel the space. And in that extra layer, you often find the real insight. Now imagine this. You ask someone a question. They give a quick answer. Then you stay silent just for a moment, and suddenly they expand. They explain more. They reveal more. That's not random. That's psychological. Because silence encourages completion. Now here's where your awareness sharpens. You don't just ask questions to get answers. You ask questions to observe behavior You notice tone shifts. You notice hesitation. You notice avoidance. You notice enthusiasm. Because every response is a signal. And this aligns with something subtle reflected across insights like that pauses, tone, and timing often reveal more than direct statements. Now here's the most powerful shift. You stop asking questions to control conversations. You start asking questions to understand people. And that changes your entire presence because curiosity is more powerful than control. Now let me ask you something. How often do you ask questions, but don't really listen to the answer? That changes now, because from this point forward, every question you ask becomes a tool, a way to see deeper, a way to understand more clearly, a way to reduce confusion and increase awareness. Now imagine how this changes your interactions. You don't chase clarity. You create it. You don't rely on assumptions. You gather information. You don't react impulsively. You respond with understanding. And that is power. Quiet power. Now, as we move forward, we're going to explore something even more advanced. Because once you understand how to observe and how to ask, you can begin to recognize different personality patterns. Not labels, not stereotypes, but tendencies. In the next chapter, you'll learn how to quickly identify behavioral types and adapt your approach so you don't just read people, you interact with them intelligently. If you like this audiobook, please give it a like. It will really help us promote the video. Chapter 12. The patterns behind personalities. At some point in your life, you've probably asked yourself, why do people act so differently? Why one person is direct, while another avoids confrontation? Why one speaks confidently, while another hesitates? Why one opens up quickly, while another stays guarded? It can feel random, unpredictable, confusing, but it's not. Because beneath all that variation, there are patterns, not rigid labels, not fixed categories, but behavioral tendencies, ways people consistently think, react, and interact. And once you start recognizing these tendencies, you stop being surprised by people. You start understanding them faster. Now here's the key. You are not trying to box people. You are learning to recognize patterns so you can adapt your approach. Because communication is not one size fits all. What works with one person fails with another, and awareness of these differences is what separates confusion from clarity. Now, let's break this down. There are 4 core behavioral tendencies you will begin to notice: the direct, the reserved, the expressive, the analytical, and most people are a mix, but usually 1 or 2 dominate. Let's start with the direct. These are the people who move fast. They speak clearly. They get to the point. They don't like unnecessary detail. Their energy is focused. Their communication is efficient. Now here's what most people misunderstand. Direct people are not rude. They are focused. They value time. They value clarity. So when you speak with them, be clear, be concise, avoid over-explaining, because too much detail creates frustration. Now let's look at the reserved. These individuals are more controlled. They don't reveal everything immediately. They observe before they engage. They process internally. Their energy is calm, but guarded. Now here's the key. Reserved people are not uninterested. They are selective. They take time to trust. So when you interact with them, be patient. Don't force openness. Let the connection build naturally, because pressure creates distance. Now let's move to the expressive. These are the people who feel openly. They speak with emotion. They share easily. They engage with energy. Their presence is dynamic. Now here's the insight. Expressive people value connection. They value being heard. They value emotional engagement. So when you interact with them, match their energy. Show interest. Respond emotionally, not just logically, because flat responses feel like disconnection to them. Now let's look at the analytical. These individuals think deeply. They process carefully. They value logic. They focus on details. Their communication is structured. Now here's the key. Analytical people are not distant. They are precise. They want clarity. They want accuracy. Now one last question for you. What topic do you want to explore next? More on influence, emotional intelligence, mastering discipline? Write it. Because this journey doesn't end here. Now take a breath and remember this line, the one that ties everything together. The moment you see clearly is the moment you stop being controlled by what you don't understand. Carry that with you, because from this point forward, you don't just hear people. You don't just watch them. You understand them. And more importantly, you understand yourself. And that changes everything.